Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we're switching things up a bit. We had the chance to sit down with Gregory Copley in D.C. He's the president of the International Strategic Studies Association. Let's begin with what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region, why it's important to America, and how it could all play out. Gregory, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Wonderful to be with you, Tiffany.
So lately, the Solomon Islands has been getting a lot of buzz, particularly the Chinese security deal there that seems to be giving them more access. So to begin with, why is that so significant?
Well, there are many reasons for its significance. One is, of course, that the key undersea communications cables all confluence just near the Solomon Islands. So control of the Solomon Islands would give you access to, or at least influence over, a lot of the undersea cables which are critical to the global information linkages, including the internet, of course. But more than that, the Solomon Islands, as in World War II, are literally astride the access sea lanes to Australia from the North Pacific and from the Eastern Pacific. So really, if you control the Solomons, you can control a lot. You can control a lot of access to Papua New Guinea as well. The Japanese, of course, sought to control the Solomons in World War II, and it was the scene of enormous amounts of very hard fighting by the US Marines going up in the island hopping chain as they went northwards to Japan. But it was also literally the anchor point for the Battle of the Coral Sea, which arguably was the turning point in the war in the Pacific in World War II, leading up to the Battle of Midway, of course, which was another milestone in that campaign against the Japanese expansion. And the Chinese government today, the People's Republic of China, is looking at moving its whole sphere of influence further and further south so that it can get control of resources, key resources. And you've got that happening in Myanmar, in Indonesia, in Papua New Guinea, and in the Solomons, as well as other islands in the South Pacific. But the move ultimately, as it was with the Japanese Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere in the 30s and 40s, is to get access to these incredible mineral and energy resources of Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. So for the People's Republic of China, that's critical. And of course, when you can control access to sea lanes, you double your importance, because you not only ensure your own access through those sea lanes, whether it's in the ASEAN sea lanes through Indonesia and the Straits of Malacca and the like, but also in the Solomon Islands to the east. You also deny those sea lanes to your opponents in times of conflict. So they're very, very key strategic points.
So talking about those sea lanes, Gregory, how about China's influence in, say, Timor-Leste and these maybe lesser known areas? What's happening there?
Well, quite clearly the funding which the Timor-Leste government is seeking for its onshore energy processing plants, because it's got great offshore oil and gas fields which it shares with Australia, and again, right in the middle of very key ASEAN waterways. What you've got there is the Australian government trying to secure onshore processing, perhaps in Australia, but the Timor-Leste government saying they want to do it onshore in their own country, and they will seek funding for that from the People's Republic of China, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is one area where Beijing can find the kind of money needed for that development, and that will give them a huge control over the government of Timor-Leste. And the Timor-Leste government, as with some of the other South Pacific territories, tend to try to play off the best deals they can get from either Beijing or from Canberra or Washington, and so they keep upping the ante, threatening to go with one side or the other, so that they get a better and better deal from the rivals competing for their attention. And Indonesia and Timor-Leste are both in that situation right now, where they need money, they need investment. China is already a major trading partner but what they want is development money, really. And in the case of Indonesia, Indonesians need funding to build their new capital in Borneo, and they also need to recover from the current food shortage situation, so they need cash. And this similar situation applies with Timor-Leste, although both Timor-Leste and Indonesia, and the Solomons for that matter, have benefited enormously from aid and support packages from Australia over the past half century.
So going forward, if the Chinese regime really gains so much leverage over, say, Timor-Leste and Indonesia, what would be the significance to Americans and, say, Australia, all the allies there?
Well, again, it would be a great ability, it would give the PRC a great ability to project further southward and control strategic straits and waterways through the Southeast Asian waterways, and that of course is critical, because arguably the greatest volume of world maritime traffic and trade and the like in commodities goes through these straits. Now, for the People's Republic of China, that gives it the ability to limit, in times of conflict, what can go to Japan and what can go to the PRC. So this becomes critical. And even today, in a non-hot conflict situation, we see the People's Republic of China using these areas for the transshipment of, shall we say, sanction-busting oil and gas coming up into China from the Middle East and other areas. So you see a lot of energy products being shipped out of the Middle East and elsewhere, in Africa, for example, and being transshipped onto Chinese vessels in various bays and harbors around Indonesia. So it's already a key transshipment point. And what we saw as the Japanese moved further and further south during World War II, Timor-Leste was the scene of enormous fighting by Australian troops against the Japanese to drive the Japanese out of that area. And so it's and the Americans, particularly on the Solomons.
And so in your article about the topic, you also noted Cleo Pascal's comments that this could almost be like China's version of a first island chain to kind of stem in the, say, AUKUS and the Quad alliances. So if that were to play out, how would that impact those alliances?
Well, Cleo is very perceptive on this, and I think that she crystallized it very well when she said that this was Beijing's version of the first island chain. It's clearly Beijing was not going to sit down and take containment very well, and the Quad alliance of India, Australia, Japan, and the United States was indeed meant to be a containment policy to push the abilities of, or limit the abilities of the People's Republic of China and the People's Liberation Army, Navy, to expand into the Pacific and into Southeast Asia. So Beijing was never going to take that lying down. So it's using its influence, and by the way, it's not a very expensive policy for the PRC. What it's done in the Solomons, for example, or in East Timor, is to, if you like, drip feed cash to the right politicians. In the case of the Solomons, it was clear that to get the Sogovari government into power in the Solomon Islands was a very inexpensive operation, and to take when they supported Mr. Sogovari in taking control of the government there, it was a swing vote of literally one or two parliamentarians, and that once that happened, Prime Minister Sogovari was able to fulfill his part of the bargain with Beijing, which was to cease Solomon Islands' recognition of the Republic of China, Taiwan, and of course move diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China. And we could see this developing.
So given how important this area is going forward, what could the U.S., as allies of Australia, maybe do to try and help?
Well, I think the first thing the United States has got to do is recognize that the real strategic competition, which is going to determine the fortunes of the West in the future, is largely occurring in the Indo-Pacific region and not in the Euro-Atlantic sphere. And one of the things that the People's Republic of China has been keen to do is to distract the Biden administration so that it moves away from the Indo-Pacific focus and moves back to a Euro-Atlantic focus. So the Ukraine war really played into Beijing's hands. They were able to see all attention from Washington being given to the Ukraine war and to the reconstruction of NATO, arguably an alliance which needed to rethink itself in 1990-1991 at the end of the Cold War. But instead now that's become the major focus of attention, and of course the US is funding this war in Ukraine heavily to the tunes of many tens of billions of dollars, not to mention the changing the attention. So as a result, the real attention is being diverted away from the US Marine Corps oriented strategies, which were designed to understand the similarities between World War II and today in the need to control these islands and to be able to maneuver forces throughout the region very rapidly. And the Marine Corps has been trying to build a new doctrine to cope with that and build new light amphibious warships which would give them a nimbleness to compete with the People's Liberation Army Navy in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. But instead, what we're seeing now is Washington totally preoccupied with Europe once again, and missing the boat, literally, in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. So essentially, the US needs to get its eye back on the ball.
Gregory, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
That was Greg Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association. And joining us after the break, John O'Neill and Sarah Wynne, authors of The Dancer and the Devil, a deep dive into murders and biowar by Stalin, Putin, and Xi Jinping. That's coming up in just a minute here on China in Focus.